ignored throughout this debate is that even if random female Indian A and random female Indian B were to agree on everything, and even if that were true, and you chucked me in Parliament as a random citizen, I probably wouldn't have the capability to propagate these ideas, and furthermore, to come up with the right solution, ladies and gentlemen. That's something that politicians can do because they're in the business, that's their career, and that's what they chose to do. That's a problem, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we're going to look at two questions that need to be asked. Number one, is there a problem? And number two, even if this problem does exist, how does the proposition's policy actually deal with that problem? And under that one, I'm going to deal with 3 sub-points. I'll tell you when I get there. So let's start with the first question. I'm going to prove to you, ladies and gentlemen, that there is in fact no problem with the status quo. This is strategically important because if the proposition couldn't prove to us that there was a problem, there is no necessity whatsoever for their policy. So let's look at this in a detailed manner. So we had 3 ideas from the proposition initially as to what's the problem with the system. And they first said to us that members of Parliament are chosen as good politicians as opposed to politicians who have good representation. Now we have a number of problems with this, and first of all, we think that this isn't necessarily true because they come there with the ideals that their party propagates, and that means that they do come there with some sort of ideal. But furthermore, and more importantly, we don't think it's a bad thing if politicians are chosen on ability, because we think that ability is actually important in Parliament, where they have to be able to propagate those ideas, so that doesn't stand. The second idea we got from them was that of accountability to parties' ideals and not to people. And we'd say that people vote for the party because of their ideals. And here's where it got a bit contentious, because the proposition tried to tell us that you know, there's a problem with voting, and they really got a little bit sidetracked in terms of the debate, because they then started opposing the idea of voting itself. But let's deal with it. Now what they said to us is that, you know, there's voter apathy, so people don't vote. Now what we'd say to them, ladies and gentlemen, is that in their model, nobody can vote anyway, so we don't see how we're caring for people's interests. Then they brought us this idea of loyalty voting. But we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that if people are voting for a particular party and they think that that party's doing a good job, we're actually okay with that. And furthermore, in their model, we'd say that there's no representation whatsoever of what they want, and that's a problem. They said to us then that people have to compromise their views because they don't agree with everything that a party stands for. But we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that first of all, when you have a political party, they stand for a range of ideals, and we'd say that different parties stand for a different big principle, and generally people could ascribe to that big principle, and we think that that's okay, and that's how we base our society in terms of who runs the country, in terms of the government. And furthermore, under their policy, they don't actually mitigate this issue. I'm going to deal with that further in my next point, and I'll tell you when I get there. So we've dealt with then the idea of accountability to parties' ideals. But lastly, we'd like to look at this idea of people staying in power for long. Now, this was kind of flawed on the proposition side, because the problem we have with this is, first of all, we'd say that if they do stay in power for long, but if they were legitimately elected there, then that's okay and that's not a problem. But furthermore, even if that were a problem, we don't think that that alone can necessitate their policy. Because if their problem is that politicians stay in too long in the system, why not just change that? Why do we have to change the entire system? Ladies and gentlemen, we've proven to you that there isn't actually a problem. They haven't shown us that sufficiently. But assuming but not conceding there was a problem, let's look at how their policy deals with the supposed problem. And I'm going to deal with this on 3 levels. Number 1, the link between race and gender and ideas. Number 2, capacity of individuals. And number 3, political functioning. So let's start with this idea of race and gender versus ideas. And the conclusion to this point is that there's not enough of a link between who I am, what I look like, and whether I'm male or female, and what I actually believe. Now, we said to you as the opposition that link simply does not exist. And the proposition didn't give us sufficient analysis in the beginning as to why it does exist. They then said to us that there's a link between my race and my conditions. And as we said to you in a POI, this doesn't necessarily translate to everything, ladies and gentlemen. This doesn't mean that everything I believe is actually in line with my race and my gender. And this links back to the idea of they don't like the fact that people have to compromise their views when they vote to parties, because we think that it's essentially the same thing. If now I have to ascribe to the idea of an Indian female, then I'm also compromising my views because she doesn't necessarily believe everything that I believe. That's something they're actually making worse, ladies and gentlemen. So they then said to us to try and respond to our POI that discourse is actually good. Now, quite frankly, they didn't listen to my second speaker's positive matter, where we told you that yes, discourse is good. But number 1, discourse exists in the status quo. We have differing opinions in Parliament, and we think that's a good can reach a consensus through discussion. Number two, they're worsening it because once you have too many differing opinions, you hinder the political system, you make it so that it's difficult for them to reach a decision. That's not good for Parliament, that's not good for the people, ladies and gentlemen. Lastly, under the same idea, we had the idea of the minority, and the proposition was extremely passionate about standing up for the minority. Now, we'd like to point out a couple of things. First of all, in the status quo, minority parties exist. They have as much support as they have, which is representative of that minority. That is exactly the same in the proposition's policy. If it's socially representative, and if it's proportionately representative, the minority remains a minority. Nothing changes in that regard. They're not fixing that problem, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we've proven to you then that there isn't enough of a link between the race and gender and the ideas. But assuming there was actually this link, we have to look at the capacity of this individual to now stand up and effect proper change. And here we have this idea of skills, where we said to you, ladies and gentlemen, that they need a level of skill. The proposition didn't seem to understand what we meant, because they said that the individual in society knows what's going on, they know what the problems are, etc., etc. Like we already said to you, we feel that a politician is still a member of society. The proposition tried to make them out as some sort of alien, and I quote, a rich old man. Now, first of all, we think we only have to look as far as our own parliament to say that no, they're not all rich old men. We like your example of Lindiwe Mazibuko. We think that we do have diversity. But more importantly, we think that if these rich old men are the most capable ones to propagate ideas, that's still okay, and we think that that's important. No, thank you. Okay. So, fundamentally there, we see that the problem is that they didn't understand the idea of skills, and I'm going to just quickly clarify it for them. What we meant by that is, if you pick a random individual who didn't choose to go into politics, who's probably busy living their life elsewhere, they're not going to be interested in the idea of politics, and even if they were to know the problems that they were dealing with more than a politician knows, where the problem comes is when we get to the solution, ladies and gentlemen. Parliament is supposed to discuss not only the problems, but how we can solve those problems. That's where the lack of knowledge and lack of experience comes into play, and that's where a citizen is not good enough. So that proves quite efficiently that capacity wasn't proven basically by the proposition side of the House. And lastly, under the same idea of what their policy does, we have the idea of political function. As I said, they didn't deal with this. I already quite dealt with it in my rebuttal previously in telling you that we have too many differing views. They're not going to reach a consensus quickly enough to make them efficient. It's a tangible harm, ladies and gentlemen. Lastly, just to add on the idea of international perception, the proposition said to us that we didn't know why they didn't think that this was important because it was good for the people. We've shown you, ladies and gentlemen, it's extremely bad for the people. That doesn't stack. Ultimately, we've seen a proposition side that didn't show us a problem, and that only showed us that their problem would make it worse for every individual, which they seem to care about. Thank you.